Creepypasta, a genre of story that was once respected. Once. But what happened? Why did we go from the utter trash that was early creepypasta, like Jeff the Killer, and many other wannabe slasher flick franchises?
Loser! You're a loser! Are you feeling sorry for yourself? Well, you should be, because you are dirt! You make me sick!
To genre-defining tales like Abandoned by Disney and Psychosis, back to mediocrity, such as, well, any number of Reddit titles. Like any internet subject, it always starts out on shaky ground. The web is a place where concepts go to be tested. Those that cannot stand up to the fire of public opinion get disregarded. Now, mind you, the early internet was a much different place than it is now. I say early like it was 50 years ago, but in internet time, 1 week can be the equivalent of 6 months depending on how much focus a subject has. Anything from the early and late 2000s might as well be a lifetime ago. To talk about old creepypasta, we also have to talk about the memes of the time. And let me tell you, with retrospect, they were both cringe of the highest order. Top text, bottom text, motifakes, hacksaw, lol, Nyan cat. This was the funniest stuff anyone had ever seen at the time. It was a new culture that Gen X and Millennials, and some of Gen Z, got to create for themselves. Up until then, culture was ruled by the World War II generation and boomers. The sexual revolution and Vietnam were some of the biggest cultural staples of America. So, for us in the tech generations, we got to build something for ourselves. Things that we experienced that only we really understood. We got to have a class all our own. Of course, we didn't know it at the time, but that early meme culture was atrocious, and would be the building structure of people who base their entire personalities on memes. Creepypasta of the time, well, very much in the same fashion, were absolutely mind-numbingly bad in retrospect. But because of the new and burgeoning culture of the internet, it was like we were getting our own urban legends. This is where stories like Jeff the Killer, Slenderman, Russian Sleep Experiment, The Rake, and more come from. The early days of creepypasta was a testing ground, and the name of the game of that time was trying to make it seem like these stories were real in some way. The older stories heavily relied on the idea that this was a campfire story being told in the digital age. A lot of the earliest pastas use the "you probably won't believe me" or "me and a few friends" trope, very common in the early days, and still used by weaker stories today. Having a few friends that ultimately do nothing other than provide meaningless dialogue, it weakly provides more witnesses to the event. "I know you won't believe me" is an attempt to be meta about it. The writer knows their story is outlandish, so this often served to try and make the story self-aware. It knows it's a creepypasta, so that means it's more truthful or something. You see, unlike a movie, where someone has to write a script, hire actors, get camera equipment, edit, and finalize the production, writing a story on the internet is a lot easier. Mind you, I did not say writing a good story was easier. However, just like the horror movies of the 70s and 80s, early creepypasta was riddled with terrible writing. But no one knew any better. But there are a few reasons why initial creepypastas were even able to hold up, and it is wholly unique to the internet. Back in the initial days of the public internet, you had incredibly rudimentary websites, created by some random person hosting the whole thing on their PC. Back then, there weren't dedicated servers to host websites 24/7, unless you were a major corporation. If you wanted to have a website up all day and night, and you were a single person, you either had to leave your daily driver PC on all the time, or invest in a second PC to host it. Another factor is that you'd see some wild shit on the web back then. When there was personal hosting, it was being done by the tech literate, who also had the tendency to be socially recluse as well. Because of that, you could find sites from people who would spew some crazy things. This is one of the larger factors of the genre's success at first, that idea of socially recluse people on the internet. Last but not least, the internet was new. No one was quite sure what all could be done with it. And because of this, things like haunted email chains, that were the very earliest iterations of creepypasta, seem like they could actually put a curse on you and your machine. This is why I always put a condom over my Ethernet cable. So what did these three components do to make the genre of ominous rigatoni tick? They add an air of, could this be real, to the whole thing. Given that many of the first creepypastas came from 4chan, we still don't know who all the authors to some stories are. For instance, the Russian sleep experiment. These days we do know it's just the product of someone's imagination. But back then, for all we knew, it could have been someone in the know about some esoteric knowledge. The stories that originated from 4chan, like the Gristers, were posted by anonymous people, and given the website allows anyone to post on it without an account, this gave creepypasta some of its initial mystery factor, as now you didn't even need to host your own website, which required a PC or dedicated server, nor do you have to create an account, which meant you needed an email. The more steps you have to take to produce something, the less likely it is you're some gray man in society that will disappear back into the fold once you post something. But at this time, you could have been some socially recluse person who lives in the crawl space who emerged from your den to go to McDonald's to use the free Wi-Fi and post a story. For all we knew, something like Russian sleep experiment could have been some leaked document from the CIA. What if this is one of the researchers themselves blowing the whistle? That was the original appeal to creepypasta. What if it's real? What if the person who posted this actually experienced it, or came across this hidden knowledge? What if there really was a kid that got burns over 95% of his body and mentally snapped, becoming a crazed killer? What if there really is a faceless entity out in the woods? What if? See, in retrospect, we're painfully aware that all the old creepypastas were written by some amateur writer who had a PC or laptop and an internet connection. I could say that they also had to proofread it and not go with their first draft, but they 100% just went with the first thing they had. But see, back then, the proliferation of writing skill was heavily limited. Granted, today it's regressed back into shit, but what can you do? Also, it just kind of makes my job as a writer easier because my minimum effort is still golden compared to theirs. But because of this lack of writing skill in the earlier days, no one really knew or cared about proper sentence structure, punctuation, or actual good story content. It was all new to them, and perhaps the lackluster quality of the story lent credence to the idea that this was some random person who had knowledge of these events within the stories. But like the people who were reading the stories, were not experienced writers themselves. Early creepypastas could be considered like journals, written by someone who was just trying to get the knowledge out there, not so much worried about the structure of the story or the quality of the grammar, only concerned with telling the world about what they know. This is what allowed these first stories to make themselves part of internet culture. They skirted the line between fact and fiction. Sorta. In our ignorance of who the author was and our lack of research experience, instead of the critical eye we have today, the internet's suspension of disbelief was far higher than it is now. Sorta. Now, because we were able to collectively take these stories seriously, at the time, their status as internet urban legends took root, which gave them traction, and eventually this led to them being narrated. Like a fairy tale being animated by Disney, the narration of creepypasta on YouTube helped to reveal them to a wider audience. Early narrations also had a mystique to them that no longer exists, which is both for the better in terms of quality, but also for the worst in terms of allure. As absurd as this will sound, when the first narrations were being done, and the people who were narrating them weren't well known yet, there was this air of mystery to the uploader themselves. The fact that the production quality was as low as it was, Narration was usually done with a cheap headset, basic audio-video editing was done on Movie Maker, and the thumbnail was usually just a still frame taken from the video itself. This added to the idea that whoever uploaded this was doing the bare minimum. Maybe it was some strange person who knew how to use basic software, and that was it. This disembodied voice could be some lunatic in a basement somewhere, admitting to their crimes in story-like fashion. As this trend of narrating creepypasta began to gain interest, this is where the beginning of the golden era starts. By this time, between 2010 and 2014, creepypasta was at its highest. One genre-defining story after another. Psychosis, Abandoned by Disney, Pastel Man, Smile Dog, Bedtime, Lost Episodes, Mr. Widemouth, 1999, Dust, Strangest Security Tape, and many, many more. See, while creepypasta started off as more of a niche meme, largely consumed by people who use message boards, once this genre gained traction on YouTube, authors from outside the initial sphere began to take notice. Authors who, for the most part, actually knew what they were doing. The fact that there were now names tied to these stories, it started to diminish the idea that these creepypastas were being written by strange people on the fringes of society. However, I'll gladly give up the original mysteriousness of creepypasta for damn good storytelling. I want to make the argument that Abandoned by Disney was one of the last holdouts of, is this real? Conspiracy theories about Disney are abundant, even before Abandoned by Disney. The underground tunnels that the employees use, the semi-secret clubs, and of course, Walt's frozen head. The removal of this story from Mr. Creepypasta's channel only made the mythos of it that much more compelling. But just to clarify, it was not taken down by Disney. The author, Slimebeast, requested to either be compensated from some of the money earned from the video or to have ads removed from it. Mr. Creepypasta chose to remove the video entirely. But that's neither here nor there. As the stories gained quality, YouTube narrators followed suit. Better microphones were invested into, better understanding of software was developed, and just plain better software was being used. Suddenly, instead of hearing something like this. This is the story of a day where there was all this blood. A man was walking around, and blood started coming out of him everywhere. This is peak comedy. You started getting, I work at a plastic injection molding factory, and it has a set of strange rules. I'll never be the same again. Now that we could tell more production value was going into these, the idea that the uploader was under someone's house while looking for a good Wi-Fi signal to upload their secret knowledge of Slenderman proxies was far less likely. Now that actual good audio quality was present, stock footage, or in some cases like what I tend to do, limited animation being employed for the background footage, intricate music mixing, and artistic thumbnails being used, this was evidence that the uploader had to have a PayPal or bank account to buy a microphone off eBay or Amazon, because Walmart didn't sell Blue Brand mics at the time, which is now owned by Logitech. The higher visual quality also meant that uploaders were using better software than Windows Movie Maker, which meant that they had dedicated time to learning their higher grade software rather than eating rats in the basement in between narration sessions. Take my word, I have very little time to commit felonies and stalk the local townsfolk while also trying to make a thumbnail and music mix. It's hard work. This is all to say, we had it good. 2011 is around the time when I first learned about creepypasta, and I enjoyed it a lot, up until around 2015. Because that's when the infection began. It started out slow, under the radar, as these things do. Back then, they still had titles that fit comfortably in a thumbnail. You'd maybe get one story that had a paragraph as its name. We should have seen it coming. When the first white text, red text thumbnail appeared, we should have killed it right then and there. The dark web finally came into the public consciousness. Like anything even remotely edgy, Redditors jumped on it, trying to seem cool and with it. The dark web was to creepypasta what radiation was to early Marvel comics. You could make any asinine thing happen, so long as the dark web was the reason for it. No Sleep opened the floodgates, and YouTube was downstream. By late 2016, there wasn't a single channel that didn't have at least 10 videos pertaining to the dark net. By 2017, there wasn't a single story left that didn't have the plot summarized in the title. Yeah, it was painful to watch. A genre that I had a passion for being eroded and destroyed in front of my eyes. Creepypasta became a bubble. And just like the housing market in 2008 or the dot-com crash of the late 90s, what happens when the bubble gets bigger than the market can sustain? It pops. In this case, the amount of sewage tier stories vastly outweighed the amount of quality stories, and what quality there was not enough to keep it afloat. Garbage creepypastas began to rise in volume because everyone wanted to be the next Slime Beast, Vincent Venicava, Michael Whitehouse, Matt Dymersky, Joseph K., Camden Lamont, and so on. They all wanted to be the next author who gets their story narrated by the big channels and become a well-known name in the community. And as any halfway decent author will tell you, you can either write a lot of subpar stories or write a few great ones. You can rarely have both. And No Sleep was not about to prove this wrong. To further worsen the creepypasta crash, I'm coining that by the way, the flood of these subpar stories got onto YouTube. Everyone is trying to find that breakout post that they're the first to narrate, which in their vapid and delusional hopes nets them the big views. However, this is a catch-22. In their attempt to find the next big story, they tried every story. This flooded the market with lackluster creepypastas and narrations, which in turn buried the chances of getting attention even if you did find a quality tale. Now, because of how No Sleep works, the stories posted there are to be role-played as serious, so instead of a shorter, poetic title, these stories are posted as if someone's describing what actually happened to them. Early on in No Sleep, cool. Whatever, they had their quarantine zone and their stories rarely made it outside the confines of Reddit. But then, a few stories gained some notoriety, so this meant everyone needed to follow the naming conventions of No Sleep. And good lord, we are still feeling the effects of it today. If you're like me, when I see that list of stories with no standout titles or images, they all blend together, and I have no incentive to watch any of them, let alone 5 to 10. Not to jerk my own whistle off, but my thumbnails, I think they're on a higher level than what's common right now. Hell, I can even say I prefer the old thumbnails of yesterdecade, despite how simplistic they are. That helped them. They might have been simple, but at least they were recognizable. At least I could read the title. At least the title comfortably fit in the thumbnail. At least the thumbnail usually had something to do with the story. The golden era of creepypasta was invaluable for those of us who got into it at that point. It was quality-focused, usually, and because of that, it encouraged us to keep up, constantly improve, look at what we could do better next time. Without creepypasta, I might not have gotten the motivation to be a writer, a narrator, an occasional voice actor, a video editor, an audio engineer. But with the creepypasta crash, I think it's in a relatively benign place. The popularity it had in the early 2010s gave us some outstanding material that I still enjoy to this day. The crash seems to have calmed things down. Yes, the majority of new material is less than what I'd want. But it seems that people treat creepypasta as more of just a place for storytelling than trying to get big off of it anymore. And I prefer that. Just go look at the big narration channels. The viewership tells me everything I need to know about where creepypasta stands in its popularity. Granted, that's also due to the wall of white text, red text thumbnails and long titles. No one feels like watching all of this. Only in a state where you don't feel the need to rush a product can you craft something truly exceptional. And I see that in the genre these days. Everyone is now, in some way, aware of how generic it has become. There hasn't been a breakout story, at least that I'm aware of, in years. In this kind of climate, where no one is expecting anything too crazy, that's when something might just jump out. Who knows, maybe the next big genre-defining story is around the corner.